Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. I am your host Deborah Luila and today we will be talking about the concept of fraud. Joining me today is Mr. Khalfani from Auditax International. He is their partner and he will be sharing his insights on the issue of fraud here in Tanzania and in the globe in general. The concept of fraud has, of course, been defined differently by different people, different websites, but in general, it is the wrongful or criminal deception which is intended to result in financial or personal gain. Mr. Khalfani, you're very welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate, and it is my pleasure being part of this session today. And hopefully we'll be able to share some insights on the topic and at least enable the general public to have an understanding of what fraud is and the impact to business and economy at large.
It's definitely a pleasure meeting you. And before we go any further, for the sake of our viewers out there, despite the fact that fraud is quite a general concept which has been heard by many people, maybe you should start by trying to briefly explain to us the concept of fraud and its practical presence here in our today economic or business environment.
Okay. With respect to the question that you have just raised, fraud, as you defined it at the beginning, fraud is a criminal or wrongful deception, which is intended at gaining a personal or financial gain to someone who is perpetrating the fraud. But you could look at the concept at a bigger picture with the reflection to what is happening in our business environment, the economic environment in general. And to have a bigger view or perspective of fraud, we really need to look at the impact of fraud and what types of fraud that daily happening in our businesses and all that. And just to reflect on the impact, fraud worldwide is a concern, it's a problem to almost every entity, be it small or big. And there was a survey that was done in 2020 on global economic crimes and fraud. And the survey actually was done in 99 territories around the world. And through that survey, it was revealed that economies or businesses for the past 2 years, 2018 to 2020, have lost a total of 42 billion USD in frauds. And that gives you a reflection of what fraud is in our business environment. And on top of that, the survey, of course, revealed some of the key, or I'll say key frauds that occurred during that period. And one of the key frauds that we could also reflect in Tanzania as our economy or business environment was customer fraud. That was the biggest among many. And then there was bribery and corruption, but cyber crimes was also on top of the list in terms of fraud that was happening worldwide. And if you take the same and reflect to our day-to-day life now in Tanzania, when you talk about customer fraud and reflect what is happening, we could go as far as what is happening with these credit units or financial institution and all that. We have a number of people defrauded by small institution or institution where they are told to, say, for example, inject a certain amount of money and you'll be able to gain so and so in 3 months or whatever. That's very common in our business environment or our economy in Tanzania. So that gives you a picture of what really fraud is and the impact in the business environment. And so to speak, fraud in general, you'll say is a false representation of a matter of fact. Could it be by words, conduct, someone portraying himself as someone else, or conceiving and not revealing some information just to gain to get a personal gain or financial gain. So in a general perspective, that's fraud and how big it is as far as our economy and business environment is concerned. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to fraud, I think what makes it so popular is the fact that it has managed to inject itself in all these different avenues of life. You know, when you try to watch different documentaries on fraud, you can come to quickly realize that even very reputable people, you know, in society are involved in fraud. So it has become a concept which has been touching every aspect of our communities. And my question is, what do you think pushes people into getting into the fraud business? Does internal controls have anything to do with it?
Okay, thank you for the question. Actually, it's a very interesting question, I would say. And of course, the second part of the question on internal control and its relationship to the factors, or what causes people to commit fraud, we'll discuss as we look at different factors. Of course, if you take the same question and take, say, a sample of people or fraudster who are in prison, and you ask them the same question, that what made you commit fraud? Probably with the 100 people or prisoners, you'll get different reasons as to why they committed fraud. But if you look at all those reasons and try to categorize them, you will come down to merely 3 to 5 reasons. And these, of course, have been properly explained on what we call as a fraud triangle, which captures what causes someone to commit fraud. And of these causes, the major ones, one is pressure. Pressure comes from different areas or different angles, but the common ones is financial. Someone struggling financially, okay, you have a debt that you need to pay, or probably you have one of your relatives in hospital and you have to cover medical bills and so forth. That could create a pressure for someone to commit fraud. But again, we have what we call emotional reasons. For example, someone fearing of loss of his status in a community, that may push him into committing fraud. And that goes into pressure. That's pressure. But lifestyle, we have people gambling. You may not be able to keep pace with your gambling habits. And as such, you will try to look for extra sources to finance your gambling habits. You look at people with a number, I would say, of relationships. A man with a number of relationships, that can pressurize him into fraud. But apart from pressure, there is another factor that is very common in most of the fraudsters that push them into committing fraud. And that is, even though some of people will call it like a after event factor, but we always put it as a factor before someone commits a fraud, and that is rationalization. Okay, you rationalize your wrongful intention. For example, most people say, this is common to most of the fraudsters. They will tell you that God will forgive me. Okay, because maybe of my problem that I have a wife at hospital, I need to get money, so I need to commit or steal money to finance the medical bills. So as such, someone rationalize his wrongful intention by saying God will forgive me. That's one of the factors. You cannot just do something that you know is wrongful without trying to give yourself some sort of comfort that what I'm doing is not wrong. But another factor which is now very crucial, and it ties directly to internal control or internal control environment, is what we call opportunity. With all those pressure, rationalization and everything, there must be an opportunity. The environment that you work, the environment that you operate should present you with an opportunity. And now, where does opportunity come along? Always is where there is lack of internal controls, or there are controls documented somewhere, but they are not being implemented. And the controls, lack of controls or inefficiency in implementation of controls could come in different forms. One which is very common is overtrusting employees, especially senior employees. You have one employee, you overtrust him with responsibility, authority. He does everything. So at the end of the day, you end up not having segregation, what we call segregation of duties, where you have different people doing different roles within a transaction or within a process. So internal controls, lack of internal controls will always present an opportunity to a fraudster to commit fraud. And some other factors which have always been related to this topic of what, of course, causes someone to commit fraud and so forth is capacity or capability. At the end of the day, if you want to commit a fraud, you should be able to or capable of doing it. So if, say, it's a cyber crime or cyber fraud, you should have a knowledge or a person that can do that type, has the skills to do that type of fraud. If it's an organization, then when we talk of capability, then you're in a position, say, to sign off payments, for example. That is one of the factors that you are capable of doing something. Because if you are not, in most cases, if a person is not capable of doing it, will collude. Most of the time, will collude with some other people who are capable of doing it, be it within the organization or outside the organization. And the other factor which is always not considered in the studies and theories around fraud, but it's very critical, is what we call ethical behavior. Some people will commit fraud because that's what they are. They do not have ethics. That's not how they were raised. It's in them to commit fraud. So ethical behavior, that will, in most cases, influence someone into committing fraud. There are people who have been raised up, brought up in an environment where ethics is a priority within his family, in his dealing with family members and all that. In most cases, you will never expect to find this person committing fraud. So in general, those are the factors that may make someone commit fraud. And you could see that they are directly related or interlinked with the internal controls. Yeah.
And when it comes to organizations, like when organizations and workplaces, different entities reach out to you for consultation on the issues of fraud investigations in their workplaces and so on, what is usually the scope of work?
Yeah, most of the organization, irrespective of the type of fraud that is being investigated or that has been brought up into attention, in most cases, the scope of work will focus on what to say a scope of the fraud. Your role is to establish the fraud itself. Who were involved? How was it being done? How was it concealed that nobody was able to pick it up? But who were the perpetrators? For how long has it been happening? And on top of that, magnitude. How much have we suffered in terms of financial loss? That in any fraud investigation, if it involves money, then someone will want to establish how much have we suffered, for how long this has been happening. But with all that, at the end of the day, an organization will still want to know what are the recommendations. What should they do so that this does not happen again? That will be part of your scope of work as far as fraud investigation is concerned.
For the benefit of our listeners who might have these concepts confused as much as I do sometimes, is a fraud investigation any different from a normal audit? And how is the concept of forensic accounting and audit related to fraud and fraud investigation?
Of course, it's a thing that confuses most of people. Fraud investigation, if you want to compare it to normal audit, we should first look at the scope of the two. Okay, in fraud, as I mentioned, in most cases, your role will be to investigate a fraud so that you identify, for example, how was it being done, okay? Who were involved, and the impact, magnitude of the fraud to the organization, for how long it has been happening, and so forth. And the second part, of course, is recommendation. But for normal audits, that's now different. When you do a normal audit, your role is to issue an opinion, and which we always say is a reasonable assurance that the financial statement, the financial position of an organization as on a certain date, and its financial performance over a period of time present a fair and true picture of the organization as at that point. So this is more of a reasonable assurance in normal audit, but in fraud, the intention is to identify where the fraud is, the type of fraud, and all those recommendations. Of course, in normal audit, you also recommend, because part of it is to review internal controls, you recommend on weaknesses noted. But for fraud, you recommend on what need to be done so that the fraud does not happen again. And this now, of course, you have asked about forensic accounting. How does it come into play as far as fraud investigation is concerned? Forensic accounting, these are skills, special skills, accounting skills and tools that they are always used in fraud investigation to collect, examine, analyze data so that you have evidence that is presentable in legal proceeding that can be used in court. One of the common, I'll say, skills or tools that we use in fraud investigations that relate to forensic is data analysis. This is not usually a normal audit tool or skill, but you take data over a period of time, you analyze it by gauging it against certain metrics. For example, you'll want to analyze what type of transaction occurs, for example, out of the normal perimeters. For example, you're expecting a certain cycle of transaction that they will occur on daily basis. But now you want to establish whether there was any transaction that occurred hourly in a day instead of a daily transaction. So that's now how forensic accounting audit skills comes into fraud. And remember, forensic is important because you want to obtain evidence that can be presented and accepted in the court of law. Yeah.
I do realize that when it comes to detecting fraud, one of the most common ways is by using the process of auditing, which if things are not looking good in the auditor's perspective, then there might be an underlying issue, a more serious issue, which is fraud. But there are also other ways that fraud can come to the surface, including getting various tips from various organizations and working places and so on. When it comes to a fraud investigator getting a tip from a specific organization that there seems to be fraud activities that are ongoing in this particular organization, what set of tools should a fraud investigator adapt in order to come to the core of the truth?
Okay, first of all, most of the fraud investigation results from tips. Actually, tips account for almost 40% of fraud investigation being initiated. They might be internal from employees or external from customers or suppliers. And this happens a lot, especially, for example, in a procurement process. A supplier may feel that because he was asked for bribe and he did not give, the other supplier was given that tender or contract because he paid bribe. So someone from within the organization or external may tip the top management or any other part that there is ongoing fraud scheme, fraud transaction, and all that. Now, as a fraud investigator, some of the organization, they have fraud investigators within as part of their team, but most of them is an outsourced service that they engage a consultant. Now, as a consultant, when you receive a request to perform an investigation, the process will be more or less the same as normal audit in terms of the phases involved. But if you are doing fraud investigation, then you'll have to change your mind a bit, and I'll explain that as we discuss through the phases. Of course, the process itself will involve, of course, you being tipped or receiving the tip, the details of the fraud. This will be brief. So you need to plan accordingly for how to go about based on the details that you have been given. That's planning. Even in audit, you will do planning. But during fraud investigation, the planning stage is a bit tedious, and that's where now it differs to normal audit. In fraud investigation or examination, when you are doing planning, you need to set your mind in such a way you think like a fraudster throughout the process. So at the beginning, of course, is planning. You will mobilize your team based on the fact that you have. Probably you need a system auditor or someone who understands the systems and all that. Maybe you need a lawyer in the team so that he can assist or she can assist you through legal matters. But in terms of technicals, now you need to look at your team. But while you are looking at a team, you need to look at a team that, because this is fraud, you need to look at a team that can maintain the details of the fraud. Someone who cannot spill the beans outside or to the organization that you are going to do the audit. But throughout, you'll do the planning, then you'll come once you conclude your plan, because at that stage you'll have known the initial details of the fraud. The second stage will be, of course, to preserve data and evidence. Remember, if there's a fraud going on, and for whatever reason, those involved come to know that there is an investigation going, there is a risk that they can destroy data and evidence. So the most critical part is to ensure that before you even start the process, the gathering of information and all that, you preserve the data. Most of the organization, what they always do, those employees who, for example, were involved or who are assumed to be involved in the process, in the fraud, will be suspended for the period of investigation so that you preserve whatever information is available. And then after preserving the information is where now you determine the audit process or the investigation process that you'll be doing. Of course, collection might involve verification of document, but of critical is interviewing. Interviewing people who were involved, external or internally, stakeholders might be interviewed. And that, of course, is a special skill. Interviewing is just another skill that not everyone has got. So that's quite critical. But then the next stage after collection of data, you analyze everything, the information that you have collected, you'll have to prepare a report that, of course, based on the whoever contracted you, you'll have the reporting lines. Most of the time you do not report to management, you report probably to the board who will have engaged you in the process. But throughout this process, the most important thing that I always tell people that differentiate fraud to other audits is the fraud brainstorming. You need to think like a person who wants to commit a fraud. That will enable you, because you'll have to analyze processes within the organization where the fraud has occurred. So you'll have to analyze it while thinking as a person intending to do fraud. That will enable you to at least trigger or identify areas where fraud could have happened. Keeping in mind that collusion could also be a case. But as you go through the process, important thing that you should keep in mind while doing the planning or the process itself of fraud investigation is to assess the people involved in the process. That's so critical. Their history, background, how were they recruited, have they ever been involved in fraud before, do they have any cases related to behavior, performance of their duties and all that. So you assess the whole thing, but at the end of the day, as you are doing the process, you should develop what we call fraud scheme. Just like someone who is intending to do fraud, you should come up with fraud scheme, that this is what could happen. With that mindset, you'll be able to do your investigation and come up with a better conclusion.
Mr. Khalfani, you have elaborately taken us through some of the causes or the factors that cause somebody to get into the fraud business or to become a fraudster, so to speak. And my question is, what then can be done? Because this is a problem that has been prevailing for so long. It is a problem that's based on the causes that we have seen. They're not the kind of immediate causes that we can just turn off. So with that in mind, what are the alternative solutions to make sure that we not necessarily eliminate, but at least make sure that we put under control the situation when it comes to fraud?
As far as prevention or minimization of fraud, this is an ongoing process. It changes from day to day because these people who doing fraud, commit fraud, they come up with new ways to defraud someone. So it's an ongoing process, and as such, in order for someone or an organization to deal with it, you should develop what I always call an holistic approach to fraud. And this now has got a lot to do with risk assessment, because with risk assessment, that's a stage where you incorporate fraud risk. You assess your risks, including fraud risk, and develop methods or ways or controls which will prevent or minimize the risk that you have identified facing the organization. But the process itself need to be what I call the risky assessment process need to be an open-minded kind of assessment, where you do not like close yourself within an organization and look at your processes and risk. You need to open your ears, listen to what is happening around in the environment that you operate, type of entities, I mean, the same industry. For example, you're in a banking industry, you'll have to look for other type of frauds that are happening around the world. You should not just focus on what you're doing, because that will give you like an indication or risk that even if it has not happened in your organization, could happen. So always you'll have to assess the risks, develop or design controls that prevent fraud and other risks. And these should be done frequently. Should not be like a thing you do it once a year and forget about it. You do it, you can even do it on monthly basis, or even a shorter period than that, weekly. You can do that. But it's so important to incorporate external environment or what is happening around you. The only issue that you can have, for example, in our country, let's look at Tanzania, we do not have like periodic reports that are being issued by, for example, regulatory authorities, bureau, that like summarize a report summarizing what has been happening in a particular period as far as frauds are concerned. But you can borrow from outside Tanzania. If there are reports that are being on public domain that you can use, so that you do not miss out on what is happening. You'll have probably not encountered a fraud today, but someone might be planning to do that tomorrow. So you should have that kind of approach. And you have a program that encompasses what we call whistleblowing. That is open to everyone, but it keeps anonymity of people reporting, and should be aggressively promoted within the organization. And at the same time, you should have what we call trainings, awareness trainings to employees, customers, suppliers, so that they know about fraud and what is going on. Sometimes employees do certain jobs as they have been doing always, but because they are not aware of what is happening. For example, we have cases of email sifting, where someone sends you an email requesting for a payment, and if you read through the email, you will see as if it's coming from your supplier. Probably it will have the details, the name of the supplier in the email and all that, probably giving you new payment instruction to what they have given you before. But if employees are not given that awareness that there are cases where this can be done by a person not more than the supplier, the respective supplier, then someone may be curious to know or to ask the supplier that you have sent us an email to ask for changes of the payment instruction and all that. So awareness training and all that internal control development, ensuring that they focus on what you have done as a risk assessment. So it's an ongoing process. That's the only way you can counter fraud. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But you are the go-to person. Like people like you are the go-to people to organizations who want to conduct fraud investigations in their workplaces. And based on the experience that you've had working in this particular field, what can you say has been the biggest challenge that you have ever faced?
The biggest challenge, first of all, is information, data, to obtain the data that will support what you are looking for. That has always been the challenge, because most of the organizations do not secure data. You go to an organization and there is a very simple, probably very simple fraud that has been committed. But within an organization, there is no process to ensure that no unauthorized person can delete, for example, data. But when you review the process, you notice that there were data deleted by an authorized person. So always has been data, because information for most of the organization, they do not consider it as important. I know some of the organization secure their data, secure their information, but most of the organization, especially small organization, small scale organization, do not keep properly or secure their data. That is the most challenging in fraud investigation. But now with fraud, I mean fraud and COVID, the outbreak of COVID, it has even complicated the fraud investigation, because with COVID now, people working from home, there is what we call like decreased controls as far as processes are concerned, because probably you had people signing documents, but now they're being sent through emails. And some organizations do not even have policy that controls how information is shared through emails. So some people using even personal emails in sending official information. That has been a challenge. People working from home, controls now are not as strong as they were before. I know there are organizations that have really financed their IT or technology part of the processes, but most of the organizations still struggle in that area. So that's the biggest challenge in fraud examination or investigation.
Well, that was it for today. It was definitely an interesting topic on the issue of fraud. I would like to thank Mr. Khalfani once again for sparing his time to join us to benefit our viewers on the issue of fraud and the understanding of fraud, not just in Tanzania, but in the world in general. Join me next time for another topic. Mr. Khalfani, once again, thank you very much for sparing the time, and I will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm looking forward if there is anywhere that I can be welcomed again in this session.
Definitely. Thank you.
So